Second Timothy chapter 4. We're now let's look at, actually we're moving on. Verse 14. Alexander the metal worker did me a great deal of harm. The Lord will repay him for what he has done. You too should be on your guard against him because he strongly opposed our message. Who is this Alexander guy? Well, first of all, Alexander was a common name in the Roman world, and there's a reason for that. Because the Roman world, before it was the Roman world, was the Greco world. And Alexander the Great had expanded the Grecian Empire through his conquest. So Alexander was a favorite name in that culture, and it carried over into the Greek culture. So it's not like, oh, there's only one or two Alexanders, so no. It's kind of like, well, it is a very common name. But there are some possibilities. In Acts chapter 19, Paul is in Ephesus, and the church took root and began to grow. Now, here's something to remember about the culture of Ephesus. Ephesus was the epicenter for the religious worship of Diana. Some people say it was a version, a variant of Aphrodite's. Diana was a fertility goddess, and there was, we don't very well relate to the religious culture that Paul and the church had to push against in century 1. And in Ephesus, it was all about what we would today call mythology or superstition. But for them, it was the explanation for why things had happened, and it provided them with a sense of a being to whom they could appeal for favor and help. So Diana, or Artemis, was the local, regional goddess of Ephesus, and they took this very seriously, to the degree that there was a tradesman's, what do you call it? Conclave, I don't know. Brain, don't fail me. But a guild, that's what the word was. There was a guild of tradesmen who they fashioned out of, most people, scholars, will say out of copper, miniature versions, depictions of the biggest of the images, idols of Diana or Artemis. The research on this is pretty interesting and grotesque. But anyway, you can look that up if you're that interested. The point is, in Acts chapter 19, Paul, the church grew as a result of God's grace and favor and Paul's preaching and effort. And as the church grew, the sales began to drop dramatically among the metal workers who were fashioning these idols. And it was so dramatic that the Artisans Guild got together and they created sort of a riot. Um, and in Acts chapter 19, they pushed Alexander, a man named Alexander, who was among them as metal workers, to the front to explain what their grievance was and why they were so upset and forceful about. And the bottom line was that our great goddess Diana is being defamed. And what will that happen? What will that do? Can't you see? And so on and on. There's a possibility that Alexander is the Alexander Paul is referring to here. You connect some dots. In 1 Timothy, Paul writes to Timothy as he is ministering in Ephesus. I believe 2 Timothy goes to that same location. And so there is this dot to connect that Paul is writing to Timothy in Ephesus, and Alexander in Acts chapter 19 was in Ephesus making this noise and disturbance about the decline in sales of their metal idols. I think that's a real strong possibility. In my mind, it's the strongest of possibilities for this particular Alexander, the metal worker. There is another possibility, and comes from 1 Timothy in chapter 1, where Paul talks about Alexander and Hymenaeus, who he gives over to Satan, that they had forsaken, abandoned, or were against the truth. I think that Alexander could be the same Alexander as in Acts 19, and that he here in 2 Timothy 4:14 calls out. Now, all that, and you kind of go, well, that doesn't exactly change my life. And you're right. Is there a principle here? That's what I want to look for. And I think there is. Paul, all right. And I'm trying to figure out a good way to say this, and my brain will not cooperate today, so I'm just going to go ahead and say it, and maybe I'll have to clean it up. But Alexander and what he had done, he did Paul a great deal of harm. I don't know what that consisted of, whether it was just on a ministry level or whether it was personally. But Paul, at first glance, you might think, oh, he's got a grudge he's holding here against Alexander. I'm not sure that's true. So in order to talk about this principle that I think is here, we got to talk about forgiving. Whatever harm Alexander had done to Paul, and I believe it was actual real harm Paul's referring to here, whatever harm he had done, if Paul was to live consistently with what he taught, preached, and wrote, then he would need to forgive Alexander. Really? Now, here's where the rub comes. A lot of us don't really understand, we don't have a very clear understanding of what forgiving involves. There is one prevailing idea that I come across all the time in my counseling is forgive and forget. Actually, it's my belief, and this opinion comes out of some pretty thorough study. I don't believe our brains are capable of forgiving and forgetting. We can push the memory away as we focus on more positive things so that it will recede potentially far back into the background. But to forget, especially something that was a deep wound, I don't know that we're even capable of that. Apparently God can forgive and forget. Although I'm not sure he forgets. I think he forgives. And that idea of forgiveness, the best definition I've ever heard for forgiveness is, I am choosing not to hurt you for how you hurt me. Now, here is one of the things that a lot of people get hurt again more deeply by as they make the effort to forgive someone who hurt them. There is this idea that I think is erroneous, that if I forgive you, I've got to trust you. No. And that's the principle I see here. I think Paul forgave Alexander. He's not trying to hurt Alexander, but he did not trust him. Why? Because he proved untrustworthy. And his warning to Timothy is, be careful. He says, be on your guard against him. Okay? That's pretty strong language. Don't trust him. He is not trustworthy. Oh, by the way, if there's any repayment, any harm for the harm he did me, that's up to the Lord. And he says it. The Lord will repay him for what he's done. I don't have to. That's an interesting and important thing about forgiving someone who has deeply wounded us. I don't have to harm them for how they harmed me. That's God's domain. Be on your guard against him. Now, when Paul said be on your guard, he wasn't saying make sure you punish him. Now I don't know if I can tell it in a brief period of time, but there's a story in the Old Testament that kind of connects to this. It has to do with when David was fleeing Absalom, running from him away from Jerusalem into the wilderness. And it's a big, long story, but there's a guy named Shimei who curses, throws rocks down on him, kicks dirt down on him. And remember, at this point, David was the king. And one of David's mighty men, his general, said, I can take that guy out. It won't take me more than one blow. And David said, leave him alone. What if God told him to do this? Which is a huge picture of grace. The battle ensues. David's son Absalom is killed. The kingdom returns to him, and he is going back to Jerusalem from the wilderness, and Shimei shows up, and he's bowing and kissing up, and I don't know what was wrong with me, but please be good to me. David pushes him away and basically says, there's no need for this. But when David was on his deathbed, he tells Solomon, his son, here's what you do to Shimei. Don't let his head go down to the grave without blood, meaning kill him. Kill him. Paul's not doing that. He's not saying to Timothy, figure out a way and get back at him. You know, that old thing, I don't get even, I get back. That wasn't Paul. But he did say, don't trust, he is not worthy of trust. He did great harm, and he strongly opposed our message. Well, okay, I burned through the time. I'll be back next time on Soul Care with Stevie Boy.